Good morning. This is the Blaine's World webcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can find other shows and other information about this show at my website, which is behind me, blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce um, Ken, Kenneth Eggert, who's a musician and college professor. And thanks for being my guest today, Kenneth.
Thank you for having me, Blaine.
Okay, and what you can do, Kenneth, if you could please wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this. So that's Kenneth Eggert. And Kenneth Eggert is a composer, performer, music director, arranger, professor, recording, artist, and theorist, a guy with a lot of hats. He teaches music theory at Brevard College and accompanist at Mars Hill University and First Baptist Choice of Marshall, along with playing with several local bands. And Kenneth, the question I ask you, and I think I once asked you this before, but as a child, you grew up where?
New Jersey.
Oh, like me, we're in New Jersey.
A town called Westfield, and
Okay.
it's a Union County.
No, well, yeah. We used to live in Belmead, which is a little bit south there.
Yeah, it's
But
down toward Princeton. Yeah.
okay, exactly. You're right outside Princeton. And that was the key, Kent. People would call everything in the state they identified by Princeton. That's how you knew the state. And I once lived in, you may have heard of East Windsor. It's anyway by Princeton. And somebody had the great idea. They changed the name of the town to East Princeton. So everybody, that was the magic. But you grew up as a child in New Jersey. As a child, did you always know you wanted to be in music?
Uh, and when I was younger, it was kind of a toss-up for a long time for me between theater and music. I got into theater first, and then later on, started to get really more excited about music. I had my first rock band when I was 12.
Really?
So, uh,
What was the name of the band?
The Fury.
The Fury. And
Yeah.
here's the question. That's pretty cool. At 12, did you form the band or somebody else formed it?
Well, friends of mine approached me. There was a couple of other people. Well, here's an interesting thing because there was a couple of other people at my school that approached me about starting a band, and they both played guitar. One was an absolutely brilliant guitarist, and the other uh, was a decent guitarist. And he later on switched to bass guitar, and I played in another band or two with both of them definitely through high school. But right now, one of the bands I play with is based in Knoxville. It's called the Fine Colombians, and that's a Steely Dan tribute band. And the second guitarist from my very first band is the bassist in that band today.
Very
So
cool.
he and I have known each other for 45 years, and are playing together again professionally now.
When you were a kid at 12, did you have any paid gigs at that time? What was your first paid gig? You remember?
The first paid gig I ever had was playing an organ inside a music store, and they put a speaker out in the parking lot so that I could like entertain people coming into the place. And that's when I was probably, I don't know, 10 or 11 years old. And I think they just gave me a few dollars for
But how
doing that.
cool was that, to realize you can make some money on it.
Mm.
But I'm a little disappointed because I see behind you, I don't see that first check or the first $10 bill. I don't see it framed. I thought you keep it, all these
Oh no,
years.
it's long spent. I
Okay.
mean, back then I had no idea I was going to end up being a professional musician. Of course, I was just, you a kid who could play, and all the adults would get excited when I started playing.
But that's
But
pretty cool. So as a kid, you were that. When did you start studying music, I guess, seriously in terms of school?
in terms of school, I went to university right out of high school when I was 17. I went to Carnegie Mellon University first as a composition major. And I was a little out of my element there because I didn't really have a background in classical music at that time. My background was basically in rock and music theater growing up. So when I went to Carnegie Mellon, which was really a like a classical conservatory atmosphere, um, I had a lot of learning to do about classical music. But after a couple of years, I really felt it wasn't quite right for me, and so I transferred to Berklee College of Music in Boston, and there I was a film scoring major. And and then after a couple of years there, I pulled like every parent's worst nightmare. I did 4 years of college and then left without graduating um, to pursue being a professional because I had a band at that time that wanted to move to New York City and try and attain the big rock and roll dream.
What was that band's name? Do you remember
It was
that?
called Blackwater Junction. It was
Okay,
actually, and interesting enough, it was a southern rock band.
right.
So interesting to have ended up living in the South so many years later. But anyway, so that lasted for a few years, but it didn't really get to where we wanted it to. And I just continued, playing in bands and working odd jobs for a number of years after that, and then eventually decided to return to school at a certain point, and I finished my bachelor's degree um, in 2008. Finally, through well, when it started out, it was it was Thomas Edison State
Oh,
University.
sure. I
Started
used to
out as a
I used to teach
started
for
out as a
I
school.
taught for them.
You did you? Oh
Yeah, for a
wow.
bunch of you were never my student, I don't think.
No,
Um,
I
the,
don't think so. But
with the
the
online learning stuff.
yeah, when I started going there. You would get all your
Right,
courses, correspondence course. They'd
right.
send you like a videotape series of
I remember.
lectures
Yeah.
and books, and you'd mail in your assignments and everything. Later on, it switched to being an online school, and I finally got the bachelor's degree from them. And then I went to get my master's in theory and composition at Montclair State University,
Sure.
and and then after finishing that, I ended up down here and I got my doctorate in music through the University of Georgia.
Small world department. I'll just throw this out to you, even though I doubt it's the case. But when you were at Edison, did you also get any credits for work experience?
I believe they gave me some credit for professional experience. I mean,
Right,
obviously, I had a lot of college credits
right.
under my belt already, so I sent them everything I had, and they allowed me a portion of it. And then I think I got some credit also for professional experience and for writing a long paper.
I'll tell you, I wouldn't be surprised, and it well could be because I remember I worked with a student who had this crazy musical background, and they said, could I work with him? And I gave the student X number of credits, just what you said. I mean, it'd be amazing if it had been you. It's so small world all these years, but throughout the timing, it was just a great way for a lot of folks such as yourself to get a degree, and get
What
credit for
did you
work
teach?
experience. I taught primarily business, but I also did a lot of work with the portfolio folks for where you said you put together that documentation, and I would do it. I was kind of the generalist for them, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was you, but that's
Yeah.
another story, but that'd be cool if it were. So you
I
went,
actually, in Thomas Edison, I don't think I took any music courses
no,
when I was there.
exactly,
I already had all the music courses.
exactly. And that was the beauty of it. That's why, for some reason, it could have been you because they said, could I handle this? I said, yeah, they have to document what you had. And so even though I wasn't music major, I could look at the documentation you submitted or other folks submitted. And that would have been cool if it was a small world. So you graduated from Edison, you went for your master's. Your master's was in what degree?
In music theory and composition.
Okay,
And I specifically went to Montclair State um, because at that time they had an institute there that was devoted specifically to something called just intonation, which is kind of an alternate theory of musical tuning and goes back. It's based more in some of the most ancient ideas about how music should be tuned, which, if you go back far enough, basically it stops with Pythagoras, who we all probably remember better from geometry class.
Exactly, yeah.
But Pythagoras was the first one to discover the linkage between musical harmony and mathematics. So just intonation is a way of understanding harmonic relationships based on mathematics. So you define, like say, there's a relationship between two musical pitches, like between C and G, which in musical terms is a perfect fifth. But in just intonation terms, that's actually a ratio between the frequencies, a 3-to-2 ratio. So their institute was based around the work of an American composer named Harry Partch, who kind of revived all this in the 20th century as a alternate form of musical practice. And he invented a number of instruments that he used to compose and perform music in this tuning system that he came up with himself. So I got to uh, study there and learn all about the theory of just intonation, learn all about Harry Partch's instruments, and perform on those instruments and even compose for them. So that was a very special experience.
So when did you decide that you could eventually make a living out of doing all this different kind of stuff, this music? So you went bachelor's, master's degree, and to your credit, which I always kind of admired you for, is you've done, it seems like a bunch of things, so you don't just do one thing, but you're kind of doing a bunch of musical things. When did you start thinking that this might be your eventual career path?
Definitely by the time I went to university, I was thinking in terms of doing it for a career. But I went to study composition there, but at the time I was primarily a songwriter, and I was focused mainly at that time in my life on eventually having a performance career, and performing in bands and stuff. And I have continued to do that ever since then, but I'd say I didn't really get serious about composition in particular um, until I was older, to like maybe in my late 30s. And, that was returning to it after having studied composition back in as an undergraduate. I returned to it later on when my wife and I, at the time, founded a theater company in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and did all like original work through that theater company. And we operated there in the Allentown area for from about 2004 until 2011, and did like two major productions with professional actors, big cast. Um, and I composed all the music for those productions. And then we composed a lot of little mini musicals for children's groups during that time, and had those performed around the city as well.
Now,
So that's when I got serious about
I
composition
I
again.
didn't know you were a songwriter also. How many songs have you written, ballpark?
Oh, I don't know. To tell you the truth, the songwriting was what I did first. I probably wrote at least 20 or 25 different songs that some of which got performed in the bands I was in, but it was really um, composition and doing classical music has really been more my path as a writer of music. So I've nowadays I have a number of pieces that I wrote. They're mostly uh, for chamber groups of various kind, like string quartet, brass quintet, mixed ensembles, duets and trios and solos and stuff like that. I have one of my pieces was included a couple of years back in a CD that was released by Navona Records. It's a solo flute piece called Ondine's Flute. And the rest of it, as far as other compositions that I've had, there are some videos up online that are available to see. I have YouTube channel where a lot of the performances of my classical music
Wait, wait,
videos
Let,
are added
let me
on.
stop you a second here. You mentioned that it's online. So where would folks find this if they want to see some of your classical music? Where is that?
You could search on YouTube for either Kenneth Eggert or Scott Eggert. I actually go by both. Scott's my middle name, and it's what I've gone by most of my life. But nowadays, I'm using Kenneth Eggert as my professional name. But I have work up on the web and on YouTube that's under both of those names.
And what I find cool about you is that not only are you teaching and doing all this other stuff, but it's really kind of amazing that you're also still playing in a rock band.
I actually play in three bands regularly
Do
right
you
now.
really?
Yeah, I got besides the Fine Colombians, I play locally with a group called Tuxedo Junction and another
Okay,
group
sure.
called Gotcha Groove. And they're based out of Marion.
Yeah. Well, the amazing thing then, I guess, I don't see it with you now, but you must have like roller skates to get between all these different gigs and rehearsals, and I guess it keeps you pretty busy,
I
doesn't
put a
it?
lot of miles on my car in
Okay,
this
yeah, I
regard.
was saying, and then you played for a church as well. Out of all the
Yes.
stuff you do, do you have a favorite thing out of all that stuff?
No, I wouldn't say there's one favorite thing. They each have their own charms, of course. I love performing live. I can't really imagine my life without that. As far as composing is concerned, that I would say composition, getting somewhere with composition is a bit more challenging, certainly, especially getting into it or trying to promote yourself later in life. Um, but it's also because it's more of a I'd say it's a little bit more of a niche market than rock and jazz and all the contemporary styles end up being.
As a
So
composer, do you sit down like every day, or does this require a discipline that you'll write for 2 hours every morning, or how does the writing come into play?
I would say nowadays, well, it depends. I was very actively composing, especially during the years that I was working in on my degrees, and I have not been as active with composing more recently. I've transitioned more recently into writing, so which is, of course, the big exciting thing that happened this year was that I published my first book.
And even before we talk about the book, which we will, but one of the other exciting things I read about you was that also, right, one of your works was recently presented. I saw that on Facebook, I think, that you had one of the colleges did, did your work in a mini recital.
I teach at Brevard College, and usually when I have new pieces to present, I can do it there as part of some, faculty concert. Or, one thing we've done a couple of times since I've been at Brevard is I've been involved in organizing a local composers concert. So we put together a program of compositions by composers that are either at Brevard now or taught at Brevard in the past, or it's basically open to anybody who lives in the area who's also a composer.
So,
So I've had pieces of mine premiered in that program.
okay, I think that's what I saw, which was pretty cool. Must be very exciting for you then the first time you write it and to actually have it performed afterward. Is that kind of cool?
It's cool, and it's also kind of gut wrenching. The funny thing about being a composer and having your material performed for the first time is, of course, you're handing it over to other people to play. Because as a composer, I mean, I write for a lot of instruments that I don't personally play, so I need to get other people to help me with that and to perform it for me. And the first performance is always kind of a nerve-wracking experience for me because any tiny little thing that's wrong. I mean, the audience doesn't notice, but I hear every wrong note, and so a lot of the time my stomach is kind of twisted in a knot. But eventually, uh, it's exciting, definitely. I'd say some of the most excitement I've had with performances of my work is for a couple of years, I was part of a festival up in New York State called the Mostly Modern Festival. That is a it's a um, like a I believe they do it as a 3 week program that anybody can come to and take master classes in various musical subjects and disciplines. But as a composer invited to come and be in that program, you're expected to write a piece specifically for that event to be performed on one of their concert nights. So I got to have uh, two of my pieces performed by professional ensembles from New York City. The first time around, it was the American Modern Ensemble, and the second time, it was the Atlantic Brass Quintet. So, in both cases, I was informed maybe in January that they wanted me to write for that particular ensemble, and then so I had about 3 months or so to write a piece for them, and then you'd show up for the festival in June, and it would be performed on the concert. So both of those performances are up on YouTube.
And by the way, you
Uh,
mentioned YouTube. Best bet again to look for you under your two names. It's Kenneth Eggert and Scott Eggert.
Scott Eggert or K. Dot Scott Eggert is another one. Yeah, sorry that this is all so confusing, everybody.
By the way, how do you
Of
spell
my
the last
various
name?
names. Huh?
So people, how do you spell the last name? Eggert.
Eggert.
Okay. And let me ask you another question about composing, and then we'll turn it over to your book. But before um, you talk about the book, composing, if somebody wants to get into composing, you as a kid at some point in time decide you want to be a composer, what do you recommend to them, or what do you tell them?
I'd say study, listen. Certainly all that I learned in order to be a composer of classical music, I learned in university. So that's still the case, I would say. But you could also, if you have a particular composer, living composer that you find out about and you enjoy their music, seek them out and ask if you can study with them.
It,
That's really the way it's been done for, you know, hundreds of years.
so is that something that can be done? You can teach somebody composing?
You can, well, composing is what you learn from a composition teacher is all of the skill set that you need in order to do the work, because you need to understand the all the instruments that you can possibly work with. Every instrument family has its own set of idiosyncrasies um, and so there's a lot of little details to know. There's a lot of details to know about preparing scores correctly, um, and you know, working on parts and all kinds of other stuff. So learning about things like orchestration and arranging are very important, and also learning just about music theory, which is basically the study of how music works. What is harmony, and what is the best approaches to take to doing it. But then again, of course, some of my musical heroes tend to be people that didn't have very much classical training per se, but were more focused and driven and self-taught. So I believe that is a very powerful way to do it too, but as far as being a composer, I mean, teaching somebody what music is or how to write it, I think it requires a certain you have to have a certain affinity for that to start with in order to make that work, and everything else is just kind of building on your knowledge that can help you do better and better.
You had a choice, composing or performing. Do you have a choice between those two?
Nowadays, I'm actually doing more performing than composing. But this is the problem with me is you mentioned like all the different hats I wear. I call it my own form of musical ADD. Uh, I tend to go in a lot of different directions and explore different things. And so, like, I had a long period of my life that I was very focused on composition. And nowadays, I'm more focused on performing and writing and teaching. So I go through phases, you
You
know.
talk about those phases. Also, we'll now introduce, I guess I have a copy and you do too as well, but somehow you also have managed to find time to, I guess this was your first book?
That is my first book, yes.
Okay. And by the way, as we're talking, I see another book there, just your whole journey, your whole musical journey as to how you got into all these different fields. It's kind of fascinating to me at least. But the name of this
Well,
book, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
a lot of that is actually in
Oh,
that book.
okay. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the book then. So at some point in time, Kenneth Eggert decided to write The Myth of Perfect Pitch. By the way, I love the cover. Great cover it came up with in this. What
Thank
was
you.
the idea behind the book?
Well, it's partly a memoir, so
Okay.
a lot of it is a discussion of, my life and my career. But the way the book is designed is each chapter is kind of built off of a story of my experience with music and used as the springboard for a larger discussion about music. It's called The Myth of Perfect Pitch because, well, I happen to have perfect pitch. For those who don't know, perfect pitch is basically the ability to recognize and remember musical pitches. Uh, so most people, the majority of musicians do not have perfect pitch. Or they can develop what's known as relative pitch, which means if you play them a C on the piano, then they can figure out where G is relative to that. But a person with perfect pitch, or it's also often referred to as absolute pitch, uh, they just have the ability to, they know what a C sounds like versus what a G sounds like. And like I can hear music on the radio or on the internet, nowadays on the internet, dating myself saying radio, but when I hear something, I hear a piece of music, I know what key it's being played in, for instance, and I can call up melodies in my mind and sing them in the correct key without any prompt.
Can you
And
develop can you develop the skill? In other words, if somebody comes to you and they have no idea of pitch or what it is or their sense of it, can you teach that to somebody?
you can teach relative pitch. I have not yet seen evidence that perfect pitch can be taught. It's, like I wasn't taught to have perfect pitch, I just had it. And most of the other people that I've ever met who had it also just discovered at some point that they had it or somebody pointed it out to them.
What percentage of people approximately have perfect pitch? Is it 1 out of 10? What is it?
About one in 10,000.
Is it really? Wow. So it's like, do you have a convention every year and all the people, the perfect pitch people come together? But that's, but that's wow, 1 in 10,000. So it's kind of a gift to have it. Um,
Yeah, it's a gift. And so in calling the book The Myth of Perfect Pitch, I wasn't like say I guess it could be misconstrued because often the word myth is
right.
used as if to say that something isn't true. And I don't mean myth in that context at all with this. I think more in terms, of course, the other meaning of myth is a story, usually some kind of traditional story that explains an aspect of culture or an aspect of religious or spiritual belief, and often, centers around, supernatural beings or, something like that. But in this case, what I really believe myth to be is kind of like meta truth. Like if you've ever read any of the works of, say, Joseph Campbell or C.G. Jung, they talk a lot about myth and archetypes and stuff of that nature. And myth, to me, is a truth that might not necessarily be true in the same sense that a historical record is true, but yet it's a kind of guiding force in our lives. Like, I mean, all of our ideologies and religions and belief systems are all based upon stories. So, calling it the myth of perfect pitch, the way I described it in the book, I guess, in more kind of grand terms, uh, the gift of perfect pitch is something that might perhaps serve me on a physical level, a practical level, but the myth of perfect pitch is having the ability to hear the song of the universe, is the way I put it in the book.
Two questions on Myth of Perfect Pitch. One, who do you recommend should read this book? Who's it written for?
It's primarily written for my students, but I would say beyond that, it's for anybody who's interested in music and anybody, particularly if you're really interested in not just uh, what good music is or how music works, but if you're interested in the history of musical practice, if you're interested in the philosophy of music, then this is a book that I think you'd find interesting.
Okay, you were telling me off the air also, the other thing that folks will find interesting about it is that in reading it, they're also going to get your story as well.
Yes.
Okay, in terms of how you progress through each level of what you were doing.
Yeah, is it based around the stories, and sometimes even the stories that I tell about my life are not directly connected to, like, say, me being performing music or working on music at the time they happened, but also, for me, tied into uh, music in the grander sense. Um, because in addition to, say, having played and performed music professionally and having composed music, I also have had a lot of experience with um, spiritual practice that has a lot to, where the focus has been on the music. I mean, of course, I've worked for First Baptist of Marshall as their accompanist for the past 10 years. Before that, I was the music director for a Unity church in Pennsylvania. And prior to that, I belonged for a while to a Cherokee spiritual community that practiced, Native American traditions. And for them, I served as a ceremonial singer. So I was trained as the, musician who would be responsible for the music at community ceremonies that we did.
And it's,
And
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, in addition to that, I've studied other things, like I studied African drumming for a time and got interested in that. I learned how to do a technique called overtone singing, which is a vocal technique from Asia. And the overtone singing, I'd say, was one of the things that really started leading me in the direction of well, getting very interested in perhaps the mystical side of musical practice and, getting interested in the music of non-Western cultures and stuff. So, the first CD I ever recorded was actually a CD of music for meditation that was all done with world music instruments and featured me doing the overtone singing.
If folks want to get hold of this book, what's the best bet?
It is available on Amazon.com.
Okay, so again, if anybody wants to get a copy of The Myth of Perfect Pitch by Kenneth Eggert, we're using Kenneth in this case. Just
Yes.
look it up under Amazon.com and they'll find it.
Hmm.
Okay, let me ask you this in terms of writing. So you did a lot of composing, you did a lot of performing. How was it to then sit down and write a book? How was that process for you?
Uh, well, a lot like composing music for me. Um, I mean, it's, again, I'd say a lot of it is sitting at the computer, staring at the screen, waiting for inspiration to strike, which is certainly a lot of what, composition can be. But uh, sometimes, even finding the words to write down is a bit more challenging than finding the music, for
How
me.
long did it take you to write the book?
I started working on it. I would say like some aspects of it I had written previously, and I kind of corralled and massaged into a book. But mainly, I did the main body of the work I did in the past year or so prior to publication. So I started
Yep.
working on it like probably last winter.
And when you're working on it, is this something you did every day? Did you get up at 7 o'clock every morning and work for 4 hours straight, or how'd you write
I wish I could say I was that disciplined.
it?
But ultimately, yeah, I had to kind of make a schedule for myself where there'd be like a couple of days a week where I'd have a 2 hour block of time laid out to do the writing. Because I just, with all the different things I do, I didn't have time every day to sit down and write.
That's the first book you've written. Do you see a second one down the road?
Definitely.
Oh, do you? Do you already, you don't have to share it, but do you have it already in your mind what it's going to be about?
I know what it's going to be. Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it'll be an expansion of some of the ideas and things I talk about in this book. But one of the other things that I did was um, when I was a doctoral student. Of course, every doctoral student has to write a dissertation. So I wrote a dissertation and a large work, a cycle of chamber music pieces that were all based in a modal system of my own design. So the next book is going to be focused on that.
So again, if folks want to get a hold of The Myth of Perfect Pitch by Kenneth Eggert, best bet you mentioned is to go to Amazon, look it up.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
And in general, you mentioned already that if folks want to just track you down, if they want to find out more about what you do or some of your other gigs or your professional gigs, do you have a website or Facebook page? How do they get information about you?
I have a Facebook page that just says Kenneth Eggert Composer. And so I do put ads up on there sometimes. Right now, I'm working on building a new website. It's under construction at this point, KennethEggert.com. I have an existing website, but it's a little bit out of date. That one is kscotteggert.com. But the new one, KennethEggert.com, that will have my anything that I have going on will be on there. And as far as the bands that I'm involved in, Tuxedo Junction has a page on Facebook. Gotcha Groove has its own website, gotchagroove.com. And thefinecolombians.com is also, they have a website. So any shows that we have coming up are listed there.
And so I guess if folks want to track you down, they just have to type in Kenneth Eggert and they're going to find you somewhere for the most part.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, I'd like thank you, Kenneth, for being my guest on this edition of Blaine's World webcast. Always a pleasure to see you. I'd also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in the future, if not before, man. Thanks.
All right, thank you.